Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I'm your host, Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Facebook Live is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul. I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to be a guest on Shaka Etc.
Good to see you again, Shaka. So right away, let's go to this week's topic. We posted a question on Facebook, and it has generated a ton of comments and questions your fans want to hear from you. Tonight, we are talking about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or commonly known as the Rome Statute. Please give us a sense of what you understand by what it means, what the ICC means, and why African countries are trying to pull out of the ICC.
First of all, the ICC, Paul, is not a court that is primary in any sense. If you have a country where the judiciary system is strong, does its job professionally and what have you, you may not need the services or the interference or intervention of the ICC. The ICC is a complementary court. It complements and supplements the weak national judiciary system in the world, especially for those countries, of course, which are members of the Rome Statute, which came into force in 2002.
A lot of people, when you talk about the ICC, they really don't understand what does it mean. What does the ICC or the International Criminal Court? Break it down for ordinary people so that they can get a sense of what we are exactly talking about.
It is a court that is designed to try those persons or individuals who have committed certain grave crimes. We're talking about, for example, crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity. That is the responsibility of the International Criminal Court. Now, the International Criminal Court so far is made up of a third of member countries which come from Africa. In fact, the last time I checked, there were like 34. But more recently, we have 3 African countries which have decided to withdraw from the Rome Statute. The first one was Burundi, the second one was the Gambia, and the third one, which is a very interesting case, is South Africa.
When South Africa pulled out, a lot of people were like, wait a minute, what's going on? They didn't give the same kind of reaction when Burundi said they were pulling out, when the Gambia said they were pulling out. Maybe it was largely because these two countries, Burundi and Gambia, have a very interesting human rights background compared to South Africa. Your thoughts on that kind of analysis?
Part of the reason, of course, is that Burundi and the Gambia are not considered by a lot of observers to be very democratic, belonging to a democratic club. Whereas South Africa, by any means that you look at it, it is considered to be, of course, a much more progressive, much more democratic nation. South Africa, by the way, we should correct the notion that it has pulled out. No, it has indicated its intention to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. So it basically made its decision known to the United Nations. And by the way, it takes at least a year for a country to pull out of the Rome Statute.
Following up on that, why is it that all these African countries, earlier you alluded to the fact that about 34 African countries signed off on the Rome Statute, but now we have 3 that have either indicated or have suggested that they're going to pull out. Why is it important? Why are they pulling out of the Rome Statute? What could have changed over the years?
Well, of course, some of the arguments that some of these countries have made is that the court is not impartial. That the court, for example, is biased against African, against Africa for that matter. What is interesting about that, Paul, is that the majority of the cases at The Hague, which is the headquarters of the International Criminal Court, have actually been referred to The Hague by government, by individual governments on the African continent. The first country, in fact, having been Uganda. Museveni, of course, the president of Uganda, happens to be one of the founding signatories of the Rome Statute, and therefore a member of the International Criminal Court. Now, it seems to me from what I have seen that for as long as some of these leaders of some of these countries on the continent believed that the ICC could be used as a tool against their political adversaries or opponents and what have you, that was fine. And that was not Africa. It was legitimate for them to do that. But when it came to a point of where one of their peers, a sitting president, to be indicted by the ICC, then it became a totally different ballgame. This is not to say if you are not a member of the ICC, Paul, and you are seen or perceived to have committed crimes against humanity, that you may not in fact find your way to The Hague. You will find your way to The Hague, especially through another path, which is the United Nations Security Council. In fact, Sudan is not a member of the Rome Statute, and therefore, in fact, is not part of the ICC. But the last time I checked, its president, Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir, has actually been indicted by the ICC. But it wasn't until the cases of Kenya, which involved Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy president, William Ruto, that a lot of opinions began changing on the African continent, as if in fact politically fire had now come into the bedroom. I remember at one time, for example, Ugandan president in fact saying that if Bashir could overfly Ugandan airspace, he could arrest him and send him to The Hague. I also remember Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, saying exactly the same thing. But guess what? Time, in fact, as they say, heals a lot of things, really. And Jacob Zuma and Yoweri Museveni, the last time I checked, are currently on the same political page with guess who? Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir.
That's interesting indeed, because as we speak today, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, Paul Kagame, the Uhuru Kenyatta, Jacob Zuma, al-Bashir of Sudan, some of the champions urging other African countries really to pull out. And like you rightly said, Yoweri Museveni, as of 2 weeks ago, he was in Khartoum as part of the ongoing peace talks. So which means, like you said, time heals, right? So these two are now buddies because they have something in common.
Well, of course, another way to look at it is that someone will tell you that the greatest friend of the truth is time. Her greatest enemy is ignorance or prejudice, whereas, of course, her constant opinion is humility.
Let's go to, I was talking to somebody earlier, and he talked about the fact that the prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, is from the Gambia. What is going to happen to her job now that Gambia has officially said that they want to pull out of the ICC? Does she lose her job or she stays on?
I don't know, but you see, she has a contract actually. I think the last time I checked is about, very interesting, I think it is 9 years actually contract. I think she will be there until she completes her contract. I don't think that should really undercut her or put her in some kind of jeopardy. But having said that, it is very interesting that Africa is being used as an excuse for leaving the ICC. Unless, of course, if you can persuade me and convince me that Africa means being an African president or prime minister. Because not until, mind you, until some of these individuals realized that it was also going to affect incumbent African presidents, did they begin to say that the ICC was unfairly targeting Africa, even though, as I said earlier, the majority of the cases have been referred to The Hague by individual African governments.
What are those cases that have been referred to The Hague by the United Nations Security Council?
For example, Omar al-Bashir is one. The other is Libya, and probably Georgia, and probably another one.
Maybe Ivory Coast?
Yes.
With the Bagbo?
You could say that.
Okay, let's go to the comments, Shaka. We have a lot of interesting comments, especially our Facebook followers, and our interns did a remarkable job. Maybe let me give a shout out to Emma, Andrea, and Jeffrey for coming up with these interesting comments.
Andrea is, of course, the gentleman from Italy, correct?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So one of the questions, we start with Selma Simwaka from Zambia. She says, the AU should create an African Criminal Court, ACC. This court should only have African lawyers and African judges. It's time for Africa to believe in itself. Do you agree?
Oh, yes. I think ideally she has a point. The only practical problem here is that the majority of the African countries, sincerely, are not democratic. And because they are not democratic, you do not really, for the most part, have independent judiciaries on the continent. And guess who will appoint some of those judges? It will be individual presidents of some of those countries, and therefore are very likely to retain influence on those particular individuals who are going to be making some of those tough decisions. So the issue is, can Africa in fact have a court that is independent and is made up of independent-minded judges? The answer, at least for now, is no. Why do I say that? You had a guy from Uganda, a Dr. George Kanyihamba, a former judge of the Ugandan Supreme Court. He was a member of the All Africa People's Court. He was in fact supposed to be the next president of the court. But what happened, because of a case that he participated in back in 2006 that involved Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni and his main political opponent, Dr. Chiza Besigye, Kanyihamba voted in support of the petition. And of course, they ended up losing the case because 4 people out of 4 voted against the petition, because Kanyihamba had voted in favor of the petition, meaning voting to annul an election allegedly having been rigged by Museveni and his colleagues. His appointment to the next All Africa People's Court was completely not only ignored, but in fact they decided to reward an individual by the name Judge Joseph Mulenga, who had changed his vote in favor of incumbent President Yoweri Museveni, which of course meant that earlier he had agreed he was going to be supporting the petition, but this time, because of some understanding, he decided to vote against the petition and was rewarded with the Ugandan slot on the All People's Court by the Ugandan government. Kanyihamba, who was supposed to be the president of the court, having been a prior member of the court, was completely denied the opportunity to do that type of job. So you can see how it can be problematic, because you could find yourself in an area where you have conflicts of interests, and the people that have power will prevail.
Following up on that, isn't it ironic that all these countries, they are sovereign countries? Why should they really be seeking to form like an all-African court, yet they have their own
jurisdiction?
Yes. Why can't they just maybe internally create their own courts that prosecute crimes against humanity, maybe grave crimes? Why can't they do that?
Paul, that is not the issue, because each country, no matter what you think about it, has a judiciary system. It has a legislative system. It has a chief executive. So each country on this planet Earth has 3 branches of government. The question is, are those three branches of government sufficiently independent of one another so that in fact they can do its role, which is to check and balance the power so that power cannot be either misused or abused. In a lot of African countries where you have undemocratic presidents, the chief executive controls the legislative assembly and controls the judiciary system, of course, in addition to the executive system. So, yes, you may have some of those systems of government on paper as being independent in theory and what have you, but in practice, it is the president that controls everything. And if that is the case, then it makes it very difficult, for example, for an African court, for example, to be honest with you, to indict a sitting president to come and answer crimes against humanity. Whereas the ICC, no matter whether you are an incumbent or not, it has the jurisdiction, the mandate to go for you.
But how come that a lot of comments are coming in wondering why the ICC is only focused on countries that are considered quote-unquote poor, countries that are in third world. No Western country has been part of this court, or their leaders have been tried in the ICC. Your response to that kind of criticism?
I think,
are they fair in criticizing the ICC?
I think to some degree the criticism is fair. First of all, the ICC is largely sponsored or financed or funded by the European Union. And because the European Union funds the ICC, it has the advantage of either influencing or controlling how it operates. Just as some people will tell you, the United Nations as we know it as a system, it is largely funded by the United States government. And because it is largely funded by the United States government, there are people who think, and perhaps rightly so, that the United States has remarkable influence in terms of how the United Nations functions. For example, back in the mid-90s, when you had Dr. Boutros Ghali as the Secretary General of the United Nations, he was vetoed by at least 3 times by the United States because they didn't like to deal with a man who did not do the job as a secretary. Rather, he did seem to invoke the latter aspect of the position, which is a general. He acted as a general. He was a guy who was not intellectually intimidated, remarkably confident of his intellectual prowess and what have you. And therefore, the Americans found it very difficult to deal with him. So what happens? They ended up dealing with a compromise, a man called Ghanaian Kofi Annan. That's how Kofi Annan became the Secretary General of the United Nations, because only the Americans did not like him, like Boutros Ghali, and they used its veto power. So what am I saying here? In fact, when you go to the ICC too, it's not only that you need the reforms at the ICC or in the Rome Statute that brought the ICC into force in 2002, but in fact, even more where you need fundamental reforms is the UN Security Council, which currently has 5 permanent members who wield veto power. You're talking about Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Africa is not on the table. Latin America is not on the table either. So until you reform the United Nations Security Council so as to reflect the current geopolitical realities, I don't think even if you reform to a certain degree the ICC, it will make any difference.
The people who have referred to this exit by African countries as Brexit, the African Brexit.
Brexit.
Yes. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know that it really reflects the same kind of dynamic or sense for that matter, because the Brexit is a reflection, for the most part, of all the white folks in the United Kingdom as we have come to know it, people who used to work in factories, they are no longer there. Those factory jobs used to help them, for example, become members of the middle class, bring food to the table and what have you. They no longer do that because they do not really participate in what is considered to be the global trade, which requires new technologies and that kind of stuff, and new sort of skill sets. Those are the people that made it happen. In this particular case, you have, in fact, people who are knowledgeable, who are more informed, the leaders of African countries, who are trying to make sure that they are not affected. I think that what I would say, frankly, is that you need a situation whereby there is some compromise on both sides. I would say, for example, that the African countries which are trying to withdraw, frankly, it's about hypocrisy. And also the ICC, in terms of the manner in which it invokes its powers, also suffers from a bit of hypocrisy. For example, there are a lot of people who think that we should be having some people from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, who have been, who have been charged with crimes against humanity. There are even people, in fact, who thought about the former President of the United States of America, George W. Bush, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, that because of the manner in which they went to Iraq, they could actually have been candidates for the ICC, except that in this particular case, whereas Britain is a member of the ICC, the United States, the last time I checked, while it actually signed on, the Senate has never ratified it.
Interesting. Let's go to more comments. We only have a few minutes for some comments. Let's go to Moses Aleka in Nigeria. The reason for regulating human access, especially in developing Africa, cannot be overemphasized. Hence, the ICC is highly needed to serve as a cushion to our leaders who are easily overrun by power. Some of our governments mix rights with religion, therefore confuse the subjects. Your thoughts?
I think that the ICC is imperative. I think it should be there. And in fact, it will be there because it does have supporters on the African continent, by the way. In fact, I think it is this week that issue was being addressed at the United Nations. And among the key leaders who support the ICC, guess what? It is Nigeria under Major General Muhammadu Buhari. It is Senegal under President Macky Sall. It is Tanzania under President John Pombe Magufuli.
Botswana.
And a lot of others, and of course Botswana. Therese Kama Ian Kama has actually been a champion of ICC for a very, very long time. And so is the Ivory Coast. We're talking about Alassane Ouattara and what have you. So I think there is room, but I think there should be some kind of arrangement that brings about the possibility of a compromise so that the ICC continue to do its job. Because unless you do that, then you obviously give a stamp to what people have characterized as Africa being a continent of really a continent, in fact, that in a way thrives in a diversity and therefore supports the concept, for example, of immunity, where leaders do whatever they want and nobody can touch them.
Yeah, let's go to another comment. Greens Kansime from Uganda. These countries that are running away from justice, for example, Burundi, is already a potential candidate for the ICC for the violence they caused against civilians. Your thoughts?
Well, I really don't know because, again, in order for you, again, to be a member of the ICC, to be a candidate, one, you have to be a member of the ICC, which Burundi is. It was a signatory. But again, as I said earlier, yes, even if you are not a member, if your crimes are seen to be against humanity, there is another path, which is obviously the UN Security Council. So even if you withdraw, as I said earlier, I don't know that if the evidence is there, if the hard facts are there, I am not sure that at the end of the day you'll prevail, because guess what? The UN Security Council will take you to The Hague just in the same way as a man called Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir finds himself a candidate for The Hague.
We have time for one more comment. Let's go to Mbibiana Mwangombe from Zambia. He says, Africans are to blame for being monster targets because they are good at breaking their own laws. They like to cling on to power, abuse their own people, and do not care even when their people are suffering. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that a case can be made that those 34 African leaders, when they are signing onto the Rome Statute, did they sincerely think through it? Other than the fact that they probably thought that here was an opportunity for them to use it as a tool against their political adversaries or political opponents. But again, let's face it, they could clearly read that there was no exception when you are an incumbent president holding office. If there was evidence, compelling evidence, or evidence, of course, that is incontrovertible, not liable to falter, the Security Council will take you there.
We have time for one quick comment from Alinda Wilfred. It's true, most leaders that have been handled are African leaders, though they have been criminals. But now, there are some of those leaders in the West and in Europe who should be handled by the ICC. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that is true. But again, you see, some of those countries that you are talking about, like the United Kingdom, for example, they obviously have the judicial systems that work. The United States, it has a judicial system that works. France has a judicial system that works, except for Russia. And Russia, guess what? Is not a member of the ICC. China is not a member of the ICC, perhaps for obvious reasons. I think that it is interesting, again, when you look at some African countries which are called the allies of the United States, in terms of how they relate to the ICC aspect of the United States. I have already told you how the United States, its Senate never ratified the Rome Statute, and therefore is not in fact a member of the ICC. And yet they have Article 98, which protects American citizens if they are overseas and commit crimes against humanity. Instead of those countries apprehending them and sending them to The Hague, the headquarters of the ICC, they are supposed to be sent to the United States so that the United States can in fact deal with them. One of the first countries to sign that Article 98 was the Republic of Rwanda. The other one was the Republic of Uganda and Ethiopia.
Yeah. On that note, Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow, Paul, we are going to be looking at U.S. elections, and in particular, we are going to be looking at the presidential electoral process. How is a president of the United States elected? Most countries, for example, across the continent is through a simple majority, or you have to get 50 plus 1 vote, and you become a president-elect. If you don't get 50 plus 1 vote, if there is such a requirement, it means you go through a second round. Does that happen, for example, in the United States? The answer is no, it does not happen. What do you need to do? You need to win what they call electoral college votes. What is the magic number? 270. And how does the race look right now between Hillary Rodham Clinton of the Democratic Party and the Republican flag bearer Donald Trump? Too close to call.
Well, on that note, Shaka, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
Thank you.